Breaking tonight, Washington's CUSMA strategy just collapsed into desperation. Jamieson Greer didn't issue ultimatums, he revealed weaknesses. Tensions are escalating on Capitol Hill this evening. America attempted to dictate trade terms to Canada through a list of conditions, but instead of Canadian capitulation, Ottawa's leverage became undeniable. Everyone believed Trump's trade representative would present strength when he addressed Congress about CUSMA renewal. Financial analysts expected Canada would face impossible choices. Policy experts assumed Ottawa would scramble to accommodate American demands. They were all utterly incorrect. Washington, D.C., December the 17th, 2025. Standing before closed congressional doors, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer made a statement that exposed everything. He didn't just outline conditions for CUSMA renewal, he published a comprehensive list of every Canadian policy that's working so well, it's driving American industries absolutely insane. Translation. Washington just admitted that Canada's strategic independence is costing them billions, and they have no idea how to stop it. And what happened next? The administration that promised America first reveals exactly why Canadian sovereignty is reshaping North American trade while Trump's negotiating position crumbles in real time. Let me show you what Greer's document actually says when you read between the diplomatic language. Here's what Greer told Congress Canada must change: dairy supply management, the Online Streaming Act, provincial alcohol restrictions, procurement policies in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, customs registration requirements, and Alberta's electrical distribution rules affecting Montana. Read that list again. Every single item represents a Canadian policy that's successfully protecting Canadian interests against American pressure. This isn't a list of Canadian failures. This is an inventory of Canadian victories that Washington desperately wants reversed. Dear viewers, between March and December 2025, something extraordinary happened in North American trade relationships. Trump pushed tariffs. Carney said no. And Canada, strategic and patient Canada, became the nation that proved economic sovereignty isn't just possible, it's profitable. This isn't just about one trade dispute. This is about the fundamental collapse of American trade dominance and the rise of Canadian strategic independence as the new reality of North American economics. Greer wants Canada to provide more market access for U.S. dairy products and address Canadian dairy exports that allegedly undercut American producers. Here's what he won't say. Canada's supply-managed dairy system works so efficiently that it simultaneously protects Canadian farmers and produces products competitive enough to threaten American market share internationally. Washington isn't asking Canada to fix a broken system. They're demanding Canada break a working one because American dairy can't compete on quality or consistency. Canada already allows tariff-free American dairy imports up to a quota. American suppliers have never even reached that limit. But the U.S. dairy lobby wants those rules loosened, not because they need access, but because they need Canada's system to fail so they can justify their own inefficiencies. Carney's response? Absolute silence. Because supply management is non-negotiable, and Trump knows it. Greer claims Canada's streaming legislation discriminates against U.S. tech and media firms. Translation. Canadian content rules are working so well that American platforms are actually forced to invest in Canadian creators and Canadian stories. Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, all paying into Canada's media ecosystem now. This is the policy that ensures Canadian culture survives in the digital age. This is the legislation that makes sure when someone in Toronto opens a streaming app, they can actually find Canadian content without scrolling through 17 pages of American programming. Washington isn't concerned about discrimination. They're furious that Canada found a way to make American tech giants contribute to Canadian society instead of just extracting profits. Every dollar those platforms invest in Canadian content is a dollar that proves cultural sovereignty isn't just possible in the 21st century, it's enforceable. This one is extraordinary. Greer specifically mentions that provincial liquor boards are restricting U.S. alcohol sales in response to Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. Brown-Forman, maker of Jack Daniels, has seen Canadian sales plunge over 60%. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra actually complained that these restrictions are why Trump's team calls Canada mean and nasty. Let that sink in for a moment. Canada's provinces unified around a retail strategy that's costing American spirits companies hundreds of millions in lost revenue. And Washington is so rattled, they're making it a condition for trade deal renewal. Doug Ford said it clearly. If they don't provide tariff relief, then they aren't getting any booze on our shelves. That's not a threat. That's a provincial premier explaining cause and effect to an administration that thought Canadian retaliation was optional. The alcohol restrictions reveal something Trump never anticipated. Canadian provinces can coordinate economic pressure without federal direction, creating a distributed response system Washington can't negotiate with through traditional channels. Greer wants Canada to address discriminatory procurement measures in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, plus what he calls complicated customs registration for some Canadian companies receiving U.S. exports. Break down what this actually means. Canadian provinces are prioritizing domestic suppliers for infrastructure projects. Canadian border processes require documentation that American exporters find burdensome. These aren't arbitrary barriers, they're sovereignty in practice. Ontario, Quebec, and BC are investing provincial tax dollars in provincial economies. That's not discrimination. That's fiscal responsibility. And if American companies find Canadian customs processes complicated, perhaps they should invest in understanding Canadian regulations instead of demanding Canada simplify its border security to accommodate their convenience. Look at the structure of his testimony. Greer acknowledged that CUSMA has been successful to a certain degree, and that U.S. exports to Canada and Mexico are up 56% since 2020. He admitted that virtually every business and labor group that testified at CUSMA hearings called for the agreement to continue. He even noted specific Canadian concessions. Carney already axed the digital services tax and rolled back retaliatory tariffs, but then Greer said something revealing. The shortcomings are such that a rubber stamp of the agreement is not in the national interest. Translation: the current agreement is working so well for Canada that continuing it unchanged threatens American economic interests. Washington needs changes not because CUSMA is failing, but because it's succeeding in ways that empower Canadian independence. This is the trade representative of the world's largest economy telling Congress that a trade agreement with America's closest ally and second largest trading partner cannot be renewed without extracting concessions, because the current terms allow Canada too much sovereignty. Let me walk you through how we got here. January 20th, 2025. Trump inaugurated for his second term, immediately signaling aggressive trade posture toward Canada. March 2025. Trump imposes Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. Financial analysts predict Canadian capitulation within weeks. April 2025, Canadian provinces begin alcohol restrictions. Ontario's Doug Ford makes it explicit. No tariff relief means no American spirits in provincial stores. Washington dismisses this as theatrical posturing. May 2025. Brown-Forman reports catastrophic Canadian sales decline. U.S. spirits industry begins lobbying for federal intervention. Trump's team realizes provincial coordination is creating distributed pressure they can't negotiate away. June 2025. Bilateral talks to lift Section 232 tariffs break down after Trump erupts over Ford's anti-tariff ads featuring Ronald Reagan. Washington expected Canada to absorb tariffs quietly. Toronto reminded America that Reagan opposed protectionism. September 2025. Mark Carney eliminates Canada's digital services tax, removes retaliatory tariffs, demonstrates willingness to negotiate. Trump's team interprets this as weakness. Carney understands it as positioning, trade concessions that cost Canada little while preserving leverage on issues that matter. November 2025. CUSMA review hearings begin. American business and labor groups overwhelmingly support agreement continuation, but their testimonies also reveal exactly which Canadian policies are succeeding, creating the roadmap for Greer's conditions list. December the 17th, 2025, Greer presents his document to Congress. Not demands from strength, but requests from a position that's eroding daily. Every condition he lists represents a Canadian policy working exactly as designed. And Washington has no strategy beyond asking Canada to voluntarily surrender advantages it built deliberately. Here's what Greer's testimony actually accomplished. He gave Carney a complete inventory of Canadian leverage points, publicly documented which policies are inflicting the most pressure on American industries, and revealed that Washington's strategy is hoping Canada will negotiate against its own interests out of some misplaced sense of continental obligation. The pattern was identical across every demand. American industries losing to Canadian policy, Washington framing Canadian success as unfair practice, Greer asking Canada to voluntarily weaken positions that are working, but nowhere in his document does Greer explain what Canada gains from making these changes. No tariff relief commitments, no access guarantees, no recognition that Canada might have legitimate interests that conflict with American preferences. He wants Canada to open dairy markets, but won't lift Section 232 tariffs. He wants streaming law changes, but won't address American restrictions on Canadian cultural products. He wants provincial procurement modifications, but won't acknowledge that Ontario, Quebec, and BC are answering to their own voters, not Washington's trade priorities. This is negotiation by wish list. And Carney's response, the response you're going to see in the coming months, is going to be surgically precise. Canada will address American concerns where Canadian interests align and hold firm everywhere else. Because Greer just proved that Ottawa's strategy is working, look beyond the specific demands to what they reveal about shifting North American dynamics. For decades, Canadian trade strategy operated on the assumption that American market access was so valuable that Canada needed to accommodate U.S. preferences even when they conflicted with Canadian interests. That assumption is dying in real time. Canada's economy is diversifying. Trade with Asia Pacific is expanding. European partnerships are deepening. And critically, Canadian voters are watching their government stand firm against American pressure and approving. Carney's polling hasn't collapsed under Trump's tariffs, it's held steady, because Canadians understand that sovereignty has a price and they're willing to pay it. When Greer presents his conditions, he's operating in a framework where Canada needs CUSMA extension more than America does. But the business testimony he cited contradicts that assumption. North American supply chains are integrated to a degree that makes bilateral disruption catastrophic for both economies. Canada isn't negotiating from desperation. Canada is negotiating from interdependence. And interdependence means Washington can demand all it wants, but implementation requires Canadian agreement. Greer can tell Congress that Canada must change dairy rules, streaming legislation, and procurement policies, but he cannot explain how Trump forces those changes without Canadian cooperation. And that cooperation isn't coming unless American concessions match Canadian sacrifices. The administration that promised to make America win at trade negotiations is discovering that winning requires a partner willing to lose. And Canada, under Carney's strategic direction, has made it absolutely clear. Ottawa is prepared to negotiate, but not to surrender. If you found this analysis valuable, if you're seeing the patterns I'm showing you, this is exactly why Canada Next exists. We're not here to repeat talking points or accept conventional wisdom. We're here to show you what's actually happening when you strip away diplomatic language and analyze strategy instead of rhetoric. Consider joining us for the next chapter of Canada's transformation from accommodation to assertion, because Greer's list isn't the end of this negotiation. It's the beginning of Canada's response. And when that response comes, when Carney stands in Ottawa and explains exactly which American demands Canada will address and which ones Washington can keep dreaming about, you're going to want to understand why every word matters. Because the next 6 months will determine whether North American trade operates on American terms or Canadian principles. And tonight, for the first time, Washington admitted they're not sure which outcome is coming. The country that published its demands, thinking it would force capitulation, just revealed every pressure point Canada is exploiting successfully. And Carney, strategic and patient, is reading that list right now, deciding exactly how to use Washington's transparency against their interests. Welcome to the new North American trade reality, where Canada doesn't ask permission to protect Canadian priorities. We just do it. And when Washington complains, we smile politely and remind them that sovereignty isn't negotiable, it's fundamental. Everything I've shown you tonight comes from a public congressional testimony and official reporting. But the conclusions, those are mine. You decide what it means.